Welcome to All Things Perceptual. I'm here with Ryan McMahon, author of the book Tied in the Cranog, and also his book Sun King came out a couple of years ago. Welcome to the show, Ryan.
Thank you. Thank you, Hank. I appreciate it. Nice to be here.
Awesome. So I know I'm a couple of years late to the party on your book Sun King, but I have to give you a bravo for that. It was the best book I've read all year. I know the year just started, but it was actually one of the best books I've read all last year, too, so I'm impressed.
Thank you. That means a lot to me. I really appreciate that. I'll gladly receive those compliments. You never know how things get received by others, so I appreciate that.
There was actually a point in the book where, toward the end of the book, I had what some people would consider a spiritual experience. On your last chapter, I got to a place where you were talking about man's seeking his own annihilation in order to renew his life force, and I could feel the shell of my reality becoming paper thin, and I could feel just how fragile our lives are as we hold it together here.
Yeah, that's an interesting, super deep, very interesting part of the human condition is the way in which our energy is renewed. And I mean, there's all kinds of language, and I think when I speak about this kind of stuff, the language is incredibly important, and it's also incredibly difficult to use the right kind of language. So hopefully our listeners, your viewers and listeners will be able to understand, like jumping from different perceptual ways of talking. But speaking to that annihilation, it kind of makes me think, even though I wrote it, a few years ago, it brings up Jordan Peterson for me right now, because he addresses that with Jungian psychology, where in order for us to grow emotionally and mentally and spiritually, so those parts of ourselves that are not physical, in order for us to grow in the spiritual sense, we have to sort of have these little explosions that go off within our being. Those explosions are really just perceptual walls that we've built up, or barriers that we've built up and placed our identity on. And so our belief systems are sort of like held within those walls, and that's what is reflected back to us all the time when we're going through life. But in order for the spirit to grow, or the self to renew, or another way of saying that, to harvest and intensify our energy, we have to sort of have these little explosions, or these little annihilations of the self. And they're very scary because we're identified with them. So we think we're losing our true self, but what we're really losing is the image of the self, or the persona, or the mask. And so to watch our own masks sort of get exploded is a really intense thing. And you can take this whole topic and just lump it into psychoanalysis or psychotherapy. But for the everyday person who doesn't have a crisis going on, these little explosions are constantly happening. And I think someone who is very in touch with their energy and also very centered is able to just allow them to happen, even if some of them are scary. And so in the end of my book, there's a part where I'm explaining how that happens to me in certain times in my life. Although most of the times that I'm speaking of in the book are they're much more intense. They're more like sort of like identity crises or knowledge crises, where the deeper part of oneself is almost forcefully beckoning to integrate. And Freud said it like this. He said that nothing can come to an end in the unconscious. And that's a really succinct, beautiful way of talking about something really elaborate. But to unpack that, he said it perfectly. It's that in order for us to really tap into our being or our true self, we have to integrate what's in the unconscious, or integrate the dark parts of ourselves. And this is like Psychology 101, but still it's important for people to think about it as they live their life, because life is a challenge for, I mean, I would sort of say for everyone, but who knows? Maybe there's someone who life is just completely serendipitous for. I've just never met that person yet. But so, but it's important to me and means a lot to me that you had some sort of experience while reading the book, because in all honesty, this particular book, I set out to write something that had mystical quality. And that's a pretty bold and big task. And I was uncertain as to whether or not I could do that. And so just sort of hearing that you had this experience while reading the book confirms that, hey, it can happen for someone. There can be these, you can read a book and get so immersed in it that it changes your perception for the moments that you're, engaged with the book. And I think really all art is designed, all real art is designed to do that. It's designed to access a deeper part of the self, and maybe that it's buried or repressed or unconscious, and bring it forward and make it conscious. So those little annihilations, they happen all the time. And sometimes they're really, really big. If you have something serious that's going on in your life, like an identity crisis or emotional problem that's deep-seated in the energy body, which also will reflect in the physical body. At some point, in order for you to remain healthy, the spirit or the deeper parts of being are going to ask you to integrate those, and those can be big explosions, and they're intense. But there's nobody that shows up here on this planet that's going to get through the process without engaging with those explosions, those little annihilations.
Right, I've heard it said that everyone has their own challenges, and some people have more challenges than others, of course, but it seems like the more a person steps up to that place where seems like they would have less challenge, they still encounter higher challenges. So it almost seems like life is upping the game. The better we do, the bigger the challenges become, it seems.
I would have to agree. Based on my limited experience, I would have to agree that is the case. It doesn't really get easier. It actually gets more, I don't want to say, maybe easier is not the right word. I don't want to say that it gets more difficult, but I will say that it gets more intense. And it has to do with, if it depends on what language we're using, but if we're using the language of energy, it has to do with how much power or how much energy you can allow to flow through you as a vessel, a conscious vessel, without hurting the vessel itself. Sort of like electrical current going through the correct conduits. So it doesn't, in my opinion, it doesn't really get easier. But what happens is that you learn how to handle or work with the intensity and with the power, and you get better at it. And so the universe has this way of beckoning you or asking you to step up to greater responsibility. And I think that, again, like Jordan Peterson says, that really what we're after is not happiness, we're after meaning. Meaning is what really makes life fulfilling for people, psychologically speaking. And so there's no way that you can really have anything meaningful happen in your life, or you can't intend anything meaningful without the counterpart of meaning, which is responsibility. And so ultimately, the self enter where light enters into your vessel is like the most sacred thing to be responsible for. And that's what the spiritual path, I think, really is, at least in my experience. When I've been able to learn from people that I respect and admire, that I see are really living a spiritual life, doing holy work, there's a couple things they all have in common, but one of them that they'll have in common is this intense responsibility for themselves, for their thoughts, their deeds, their speech, and of course their actions. So the universe sets it up to where I think power is really infinite. It's really limitless. And we set the limits as to how much we're able to handle at any particular juncture in our life.
Right. I've seen that some people who don't have much going on in their life, they seem to have more like panic attacks, and it's almost as if they're stirring up trouble for themselves, maybe not on purpose, but just as a way to get that out of the energy.
Yeah, I think the key word that I hear when I'm listening to you in that statement is purpose. So any desire to take on more responsibility if you don't have a purpose. Purpose offers meaning, again. And so people that have high anxiety, of course it can be directly related to trauma. There's no doubt about that, whether it be ancestral trauma or trauma that's happened here, right now, like in their own life. But even so, the trauma is a coping mechanism. It's a psychological barrier, sort of a comfort, a shell of comfort, that you're okay with being in. But the nature of life and life force it's infinite. So it's transformative and evolutionary. If it weren't, then it would just be stagnant. It would actually have no impetus to grow or change. And of course, life is constantly in a process of growth or fecundity. So we have to find a way to deal with those anxieties. And I think willfully intending to face them, no matter how small you start with, is going to give you purpose. And that purpose is going to offer you vision and to begin a pathway, to start somewhere and to have a place to end up. So anxiety is sort of a state of arrested development, in my opinion.
Speaking of pathways, I feel like we're on a almost parallel path. I myself was encouraged to pursue a spiritual path from a young age. My parents are both into finding the mysteries of the universe, or your true self, and blending that together. And I started having visions from as young as age 8, and spiritual experiences. And so I've always wanted that and sought after it. And each vision I've had has been very special to me and a part of my growth. I don't know if you've had encouragement from a young age, or how did you get started on your path?
It's a good question. As a child, I was always very, very, very artistic, very open creatively. I had a very powerful imagination, and that was the places in myself where I felt natural. I felt comfortable, so I would always use the part of my creative soul to reflect and learn about myself. But I would definitely say that from a young life, I have had spiritual experiences, and some of them, what people would call paranormal or sort of irrational, things you can't explain, happen. Visions, I've had those, and also I've had, as a child, I had the deep, intense, sort of night tremors, those terrible dreams that some kids get. And I can still recollect that some of those dream states, even when I came out of them, I was still such in a non-ordinary state of awareness, even as a child, or non-ordinary state of reality. And as a child, you have no reference point. You don't really know what sort of world you're in, what sort of realm you're in. And but how did I get to my path? Well, my childhood was always marked with it. I spent a lot of time in nature, and I was really comfortable being alone in nature. I grew up in the South in a deciduous forest, and I was always hunting, fishing, and I had a lot of pasture land and horses and cows behind me, and we just lived in a time where kids were really like a great place to grow up. A lot of freedom, a lot of just the great outdoors, you know. This urban environment where you'd have to worry so much about, like, say, a criminal predator or like a robber, or, you know, we lived kind of out in the sticks, and so everybody just let their kids roam free, and so we were able to be kids. We were able to play games and create games and access that part of ourselves that I think all kids need. It's crucial for personality development. But even when I wasn't around other kids, I was totally happy with going outside and being outside. And I was fully into it. I watched the birds and the squirrels, and I was in a hunting mode as a child. Even if I wasn't hunting, I was still always seeking to pay attention to the animals and see what I could see, follow them, you know, where are they going, what are they doing, listen to them. And so to kind of jump a little bit ahead, like the real crux of how I got onto the path was when I was 19 years old. I'd recently moved to California, and I was a pretty good athlete most of my life. I did a lot of sports, but I was pretty good playing soccer, and I let go of a second-year scholarship to move out to California and to with the attempt to claim another one. And so I got here, and within 6 or 7 months of training, I hurt myself really bad. And it's a very long story as to how to heal that process. And I'm actually still in the healing process from that. And in those early stages of healing, my body was stricken so severely that I could barely move on the left side of my body, and I was in chronic pain 24 hours a day, mostly around my groin and my hips and my lower back. That was the main spots, but it ended up taking over the whole left side of my body. And no one could help me, and no one really could diagnose me either. Doctors couldn't quite tell what was going on, what was going wrong with me. And so I had this identity crisis where I was in so much pain, and I was desperate to get out of it, that I was at my wit's end at that point, and no one was able to help me. And so I had contemplated, you know, leaving this world, and like very seriously. And there was a moment, I'll never forget it. There was a moment in my life where I was laying on the floor trying to stretch my lower back, but the more I stretched, the more intense the pain got. And so you know, I was just in agony, like real agony. And it was, there was this moment where I felt like I could leave my body, like if I chose to. It was a really strange feeling. I wrote about this in my first book because I've never experienced any feeling like that up to that point. And I had this conversation with myself, and I had this conversation with God or with Spirit. And I said, oh, I can actually leave right now. Like, I don't know how to explain it other than a knowing. It was like I knew that I could leave the body right where it was, and I could leave it for good. And at 19 years old, this conversation with Spirit, and I was like, is this the thing to do? How am I going to get through this if I don't leave this body? And I had a very strong rush of images and sort of like a voice, but it didn't come in audio terms. It was more of like a picturesque kind of symbols and images. And I guess you could say sort of an inner vision. And what came through was the meaningful things in my life at that point, and it was mostly my family. It was the people that I cared about and that I knew cared about me. And so I thought, man, I cannot leave my immediate family behind. I can't leave my brother. I can't leave my mom, my dad, my younger brother, my grandparents, these people that I loved. And I thought, wow, if I leave right now, they're going to be so confused. They're going to be shocked. They're going to go, what happened? I mean, like, I knew he was having trouble. I knew he was in pain, but what happened? Why did he go? And it would probably rock their worlds. And this is what happened. This was my thinking at the time. And for some reason, I had this conversation, and the Spirit said, you can actually get through this, but it's going to be, I would say the way that it was presented was, there is a way through this, but it's way harder than you can understand right now at this moment. It's so hard that you won't be able to see the pathway through at this point. And I had to make this choice. And don't get me wrong, I was scared of death as well. I mean, I was like, okay, I don't really want to die. That seems scary. But I'm in so much pain and so much agony that the alternative of leaving sounds pretty good. And so I had to balance the fear of dying, the fear of death, and the fear of leaving all the things I love behind and the people. And I got this confirmation from the Spirit that there was a way, even though I wasn't told the way. And so I decided to stay. And I knew at that moment that I had no choice but to remove everything else in my life and make the healing of my body the only thing of priority, like the only thing worth focusing on. And so there was this like point of deep concentration where I was like, okay, nothing in the world matters except this. And that might seem very selfish, but it's really like the virtue of selfishness. Like Ayn Rand talks about the virtue of selfishness. It's not the selfishness that most people would think when you hear that term. It's regenesis or genesis. It's self-renewal, the knowledge of how to renew oneself. And it's deep inside all humans, but you're not going to necessarily access it unless you need it, unless you're up against the wall. And so I was up against the wall in this psychological, emotional, physical, and spiritual state of intense brokenness, But I had no idea how I was broken. I didn't know how it unfolded so intensely, like from a basic soccer injury. And then I know this is kind of a long-winded answer, but through the healing process, through my spiritual process where I committed to healing, and I do believe that the Toltecs are right when they say that the main reason why people turn towards a spiritual way, the primary reason is for some sort of healing. And so that's what happened for me. And I realized that this level of commitment was the only way, and that changed my life at that moment. And so I'll sort of try. Not too long after that experience, I was dating a woman, and it was a pretty interesting relationship. She was much older than I am. It was a very unique relationship, and she was seeing a clairvoyant and talking about this woman that she was seeing all the time, and I was interested. I've always been open and interested. I had already had strange experiences, paranormal vision type experiences in my youth. So when someone were to talk about clairvoyance, I was like, yeah, I know that that's probably real because of my experiences. Again, trying to make this story short, longer story short, I chose to go see this woman, this clairvoyant, secretly because I felt like she was filling my girlfriend's head with a bunch of nonsense. My girlfriend kept coming home and talking about me, saying things about me that she got from this woman. And I was like, this is ridiculous. I've never met this woman. she's talking a bunch of crap, and she's filling your head with a bunch of nonsense. And I was like, I got sick of it. So I basically made an appointment with this woman to secretly tell her to stop doing that. And so I made the appointment. I had to wait, I don't know, I think I had to wait like a month to see her. Had no idea what she was about. And I went to see her, and I thought it was going to be this like real short, like, hey, you know, I'm here to tell you to just stop your bullshit, you know? And boy, I was in for a big surprise. And so this woman's name is Antoinette Spurrier, and she's my first spiritual teacher. And I still work with her today. And my life changed when I saw her, when I met her. I sat down in a house with her. I let her introduce herself. She said some prayers. And I was just like, okay, I'm going through the motions, blah, blah, blah. And then about 4 or 5 minutes just being in her presence, I just saw this big radiant light start to glow, like from behind her head. And it's in the middle of the day. I'm just sitting in her living room, and I was just like, whoa, does she know this is going on? And I'm like looking at this light, and it starts getting bigger and bigger, and it starts changing color. It's going from like a turquoise fuchsia to like this bright, almost hot pink, and then yellowish gold, and then white. And it's just radiating off of her. And I'm just listening to her talk about her background, about who she is, her history. She's kind of just basically introducing herself to me. And I'm just like awestruck. And so I thought, okay, I better pay attention. This is something I've never experienced before. This is real. And I never did tell her to to stop filling my girlfriend's head with mumbo jumbo, because we had this 2-hour long conversation, and she tapped into like some deeper part of myself, and was revealing things about myself that only I knew, and no one else no one on earth knew certain things about me, and she was able to see them. And I thought, this is just incredible. This is wild. And we recorded all those sessions, and I've gone through, described them all, and that's actually how first book is a lot of these transcriptions and other experiences that have happened throughout this 20-something year healing process. And I'll just kind of say, I've mentioned this in a couple other quick interviews briefly, but that first time that I met, at the end of the 2 hours, she said, okay, look, we're going to say a prayer, and we're going to seal up this meeting with the light. And at this point, I hadn't told her that I was already seeing this light. And so I thought, okay, she knows what's going on. She's talking about. And the whole time I was talking to her, I could see her glowing. Sometimes it was real mild, and sometimes it was really intense. And I just never said anything, but I was just kind of like, it was a bit hypnotic. I was stuck there in amazement. And then at the end of it all, she said a prayer, and she said a prayer she's basically a practitioner of yoga. She follows the path, the Kriya Yoga path of Paramahansa Yogananda and his line of masters. And she said this prayer, and she started chanting, and her tone of voice completely changed. She didn't sound anymore. And then the whole room filled with light, where I couldn't see anything. Like she disappeared. She became like a light bulb, and the whole room filled up. I couldn't see the windows behind her. I couldn't see the walls behind her. I couldn't see all the pictures on the wall, and I couldn't see her television set. It was like I was just being bathed with this radiant light. And so as that happened, and this is pretty strange stuff, as that happened, a group about 6 different people showed up in a light form, in a spiritual form, and they were all men except for one was a woman. And so none of them looked like her. None of them looked like Antoinette. Antoinette disappeared into the light, and then these beings showed up and just stared at me and looked right at me and stayed there, and then would disappear, and then another one would show up. And I know this is really hard for some people to probably to believe, but it's what happened. So people that are open to it, like yourself, that have had vision type experiences, are going to go, okay, I can allow myself the awareness to think this could be happening. This could happen. This is true. People that have never experienced the spiritual world, they just either choose to believe that it exists because of cultural paradigms, like their religious beliefs, or people have told them that it exists, or they've read it or seen it in movies, or some other way. They just choose to believe that it exists, or they don't. They say, "Oh, I've never." It's all imagination, and there's nothing I can do for those people. The spirit came into my life in this way, and I didn't, make it happen. I didn't willfully choose it, at least not consciously. And I'm now, I know, by working with the spiritual world for a long time, that the whole reason why this happened, well, there's probably multiple reasons, but the main reason why this happened was because my spirit was having a hard time staying in the body and using the body as a vessel for growth. It was so injured and so let's say malnourished. And I don't mean physically malnourished. I mean emotional, like your mental hygiene, your emotional hygiene, obviously your spiritual hygiene. And then I guess we do have some free will, because I chose to stay in the body and commit to this path of healing. Although I was terrified. I was terrified that I wouldn't be able to do it. And but this particular event in my life changed everything, to where I had no these people were that showed up in the light, and some of them were of, like, it's strange, they were of different races. So one of them was, two of them I think were clearly Indian, like yogi style, Hindu style people, and then two of them were Caucasian, and one was very very fair haired, blonde, fair haired, bearded, like European type of Caucasian. And then later on, and I've seen this has happened more than once, later on, I actually recognized a Native American person come through on a whole different meeting, like years later. But anyway, I left there. I got in my car, and I could barely function. I couldn't think. I couldn't talk. I went home and I was exhausted. I was literally like, I could barely drive home. I got to my house and I sat down, and I just had to process all this. And to be honest with you, I'm still processing all of this. It was so intense at the time that it changed my idea of reality, and my life took a hard turn, and it just changed direction completely. And I realized that there is a spiritual world, or this is a spiritual world, and that even though appearances are maybe that they're not, they're like, it's very physical. You have a physical body. You're dealing with a three-dimensional world. You have to go about your daily routines. That doesn't seem too spiritual, but when you actually have a vision like yourself, I know that you've experienced the spiritual world, then you can't be the same afterwards. It's like you can't unknow what you know. And now you have a different awareness, and it's a part of you. It's a part of your cumulative life experience. And now I live with that, and I work with it, and I try to make sense of it. And that's what my books are really about. My first book is a recapitulation, which is basically just a raw, somewhat stream of consciousness attempt to organize and process these experiences. And so it was very cathartic to write it down and to organize it, because it gave me a great deal of self-reflection in that process, and it was very therapeutic. And it's how I've sort of come to concepts that I sort of stand on now and go, okay, this is the way the world works. But don't get me wrong, those concepts are probably somewhat unique to me and my experience. So this is the way the world works for me. It may not work the same for someone else, but it doesn't make it any less real. So that's how I came to the beginning of my spiritual path.
That's that's an interesting story. I'm gonna have to get your first book now. Is that available only on the Kindle app right now?
No, that it's available in paperback. The Kindle app, it's available for a pretty short, small price. I think it's like $3. It's the only one that I have in digital form right now. I think my second book will be in audio form this year. I have a very special narrator who's in the process of narrating it, which I'm really happy about. He's amazing. But no, Tide in the Cranog is available in paperback, and that's the way that I like to read, because I like to experience like the smell of the pages and the feel of a book, and I like to be able to pause and put it down. And I don't know, but Kindle is great too, because you can house like thousands of books in this one little device. So, but no, it's out there. Yeah.
I love the smell of a great book, and I got to say that your spiritual experience is on par with a lot of the experiences I've had, where when you're spoken to, it's not necessarily in words, but it comes in just a pure knowing, kind of, if you know what I mean. And the people who haven't experienced that, there's, like you said, there's those that believe, who can just say, okay, I feel like that's a real thing. But then there's the scientific deniers that would say, oh, it's a chemical in your brain made you experience that. But you really got to be there to understand.
Yeah, you definitely do. And I think you're totally right. You said it really well, is that it is a pure knowing, and it's also a pure language. And that's one of the things that I've been wrestling with for a while now, is like language itself. And we don't have to get into that. That's going to be like a massive topic. But the spiritual, the world itself is a language. There is an organization, an intelligent organization known as nature, sets up the matrix that builds all of life and sustains it and renews it and then causes it to transform. And we're no different. We're a part of that matrix, that nature. And I believe, like Carl Jung and Michael Tessarian speaks really well about this, that the mind itself actually is nature. It like truly is nature. This is not like a way of talking, like it really is nature. And so the way that nature appears to us, like the trees and the birds and the bees and the clouds and the colors and the movements and the patterns, that's actually our mind. Our mind is exactly like that. It is that. We just have the ability to personalize it and tap into this personal inner part of it, or reflection of it. And so there's a language that exists in nature, which is the foundation of all language, whether it be symbols, letters and alphabets, musical notes and tones, or the language of light and dark, the language of energies, the language of spirit. And so the reason why I'm so interested in language is because I will admit that I've not really been able to make sense out of some of these visions. It's like I know they're happening, and I know that they have meaning for me in my life, because they've totally changed my awareness, and they've totally changed my life in a positive way and brought me in new direction. So I know they have meaning. But they don't come, at least to me, they don't come to me and then spell things out. Like, hey, this is what's happening. This is what's going on. This is what you should do. This is what you should listen to. There's none of that. It's like this. It's like language before language came into being. It's like the foundations of language itself. I think it's nature, and some people would say it's supernatural, but I think what it really is just natural. Um, and I'm still learning how to articulate the natural language, or speak it, or listen to it, understand it. There's a great deal of listening, a great deal of of silent knowledge, or what the Toltecs and what Carlos Castaneda talks would say is silent knowledge. That's like a reservoir of the infinite, and we have, human beings somehow have access to it. And I think that people that have spiritual experience are inclined to go there more often, go there and listen to it, or tap into it as a resource for living, for life.
I feel like animals naturally have this ability to communicate through that spirit, the way of the spirit, because you can see animals organizing and moving together like a flock of birds will all take the same path at once. And how do they do that? People are always looking for like an audio or visual cue, but I think that one day we're going to find out that it's just intuition, and that they know how to use silent knowledge and tap into each other and connect. Whenever I observe nature, it seems like that's the way it is, to me at least.
Yeah, there's ways to talk about this. I think it is, you could call it silent knowledge. It is silent knowledge. It's natural wisdom. It's a natural mystic, as Bob Marley would say. And the Toltecs would say that the universe is made up of attention or awareness. Those two words are not the same, but they sort of get to the same place. And that our attention, or our paying attention, offers us pathways into this silent knowledge, or this natural mystic, or this natural knowledge. And it has to do with how well you can pay attention, or how your intent connects with tension. Intent is tension that's within. It's your intended. It's your intended intention, right? And this is why words and language are so interesting, because words are super important. That's what we're doing right now. We're talking about something incredibly difficult to talk about, and yet we're using words because it's the best possible way for us to communicate, but it's also the limitation of communication. It's like, no matter what words we choose, they're still going to fall short of life experience, of experience itself, or of the natural mystic itself. So it's a strange place to be. We're sort of pigeonholed by language, but we also have no greater tool than language to try to express these things.
I like the way you break it down. It seems like you're really kind of drilling into the core of what language really is, where a lot of people just take it for granted. These are the words we speak. They mean what we think they mean. But when you break down each word individually, it really opens up the truer meaning. And I got a little taste of that in learning Spanish, the Spanish language. I'll hear a word in Spanish, and I'll say, oh, it's similar to an English word, and I'll say, okay, that's why that word means what it means. It's just interesting to dive in to that subject.
Yeah, that subject to me is extremely fascinating. And if people that are listening, your viewers, your listeners, there's a couple of people that'll just crack this world open for you. And one is William Lawrence Lyons. He wrote a book called The Language Crystal, which is very hard to find these days. It's out of print, but it's not a normal book. It's a book that will offer you some mystical experience, like kind of what we've talked about earlier. He has really decoded and de-encrypted the esoteric structure of the alphabet. And it's not just the English alphabet, but that's the one that the book's written in, so it focuses on English. But it goes back to Phoenician and ancient Hebrew and even the rune, what I would say are the runes, Hebraic language, which would be Scandinavian, northern, the runes of Odin, which is a mythology, but I think there's some truth in that mythology. He was able to tap into and discover the runes, which I think are the early symbols of the Hebraic alphabet and the Phoenician alphabet and other conglomerates, the Greek. They sort of all borrow from each other. But William Lawrence Lyon's The Language Crystal is well worth reading if someone wants to really understand the power of your speech and of words. And then another great person to look at is Alvin Boyd Kuhn. And he wrote a book called, I think it's just called The Esoteric Structure of the Alphabet. I have it here. It's fascinating. And he goes through, it's a similar process. He doesn't break down the alphabet quite the same way, but he basically gets to the same points, and he breaks them down like as their symbols, how the symbols came to be the shape that they're in, and showing that it's not arbitrary, that we didn't just grunt a sound like ah, and then randomly draw a symbol that's supposed to represent ah. There was a process that actually is rooted in nature. People find this hard to believe, but a process that's rooted in nature, where these symbols we paid attention to the way, it's a long story, but the way light reflects off of a particular object over time, and the shadows change and morph into different configurations, and then we use those configurations to represent a tone like ah, and if the tone is, say, a tone at the beginning of an alphabet, like it would be an early stage of the morphing of this shadow. Hopefully that makes sense to people. But the esoteric structure of the alphabet is a real thing, and it's a different way of seeing. If you read it and you understand it, it will move your assemblage point. It will offer you a different perception of awareness, and it'll change the way in which you see and use words, and the way in which they reflect back to you in your environment. And I'll kind of like sort of say this, like once I started reading and looking at the nature of the structure of the alphabet and its esoteric, deep layered meanings of its meanings, I started to see words in my environment all the time, and they started to really resonate with me in different ways. And I was pretty hypersensitive. I still am hypersensitive to like negative speech, negative words, negative symbols, or symbols that have been perverted, that used to be sacred and have been twisted purposefully to hide their original sacredness. And people don't realize, like, maybe this probably won't resonate with a lot of people, but it resonates with me. It's like, I remember seeing, I like to drink beer. I remember seeing, a beer truck roll up across the street from some restaurant I was in, and it's a Stone Brew, they make beer, and it's a huge truck with a demon on it. It's like a devil with horns, and it's got these big like bat-like wings, and it's mounting, it's standing over and sort of mounting another object, like it's dominating it, and then underneath that it's the name of the beer is Ruination. That's the beer. You go, hey, I'd like to order a Ruination, please. And you look at the words there, and it's like, to ruin a nation, to ruin a people. And it's our nation. It's America. It's the nation in which Stone Brewing Company functions in. And I don't know if Stone Brewing Company really understands the nature of the symbols that they're using. They might think it's edgy and cool. But if you're standing there, and you're drinking out of a bottle that has this symbol on it, and it's this demon looking at you every time you take a sip, and it says ruin your nation, there's a deep psychological problem there, because you're just willfully drinking something that even if it's not truly toxic, like maybe the beer is totally good for you, but psychologically it's not good for you. Psychologically, it would be like if you're an open-minded person and I were to like wound you with derogatory speech, you know, if I were to belittle you over and over and over and over and over and over again, at some point you might start to hear that in your subconscious mind and not even know it, and you'd be like, oh, you know what? Maybe I am a terrible person. Why do I think I'm a terrible person? You might not realize it's because someone's been telling you you're a terrible person, right? But maybe you're not a terrible person. Maybe you just have allowed that to seep into your subconscious mind. And like Freud said, nothing can come to an end in the unconscious or the subconscious. So eventually, those symbols are in there, and they're a part of you, and they're gonna play their role. They're gonna come out at some point, and they're gonna bubble up to the surface because your conscious mind is forced to integrate them. You're gonna have to deal with, you know, this is just one tiny little thing, the power of language, the power of speech. And I started to see all these different words and all these different symbols and all these different meanings in my daily environment, and start to, you know, really pay attention to what I allow in my environment. You know, the environment that I can control, like my home environment or my work environment. I'm not gonna have these type of words, you know, peering at me from the walls. I'm not gonna have those type of symbols, because I do think that they weigh in. I think that's the nature of art. It's a part of your heart. It weighs into your heart. It weighs into your inner knowing. So, yeah. So there.
Right. I'm familiar with stone brewing, and I haven't actually thought about it. That's one of those things that people don't think about unless you do it on purpose. Forgot what I was going to say.
No, I know I'm kind of like going off here, but the nature of symbols, you know, and the nature of language is extremely important. And I think that the more attention, right, back to tension, the more attention that you pay to your own being, your own self, which is really the only thing you have any control over, then the more attentive you will be as a practicing human, and you'll just simply have greater access to the universe at large, because if the Toltecs are right, the universe or the infinite is really held together by tension or attention. And so we're a part of that. We have access to it if we choose it. If we choose to strengthen that part of ourselves.
All right, Ryan. Well, I think we've been we're pretty close to our first hour now. Is it now a good time for you to take a break?
Sure. Yeah, that works.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us for our first hour. We'll be back for the second hour, and I'll see you then.